Ned Stark is called the most honorable man in Westeros, but by the law of the Seven Kingdoms, he committed treason at least 3 times before he ever lost his head. And one of those betrayals wasn't just about honor. It was about a promise, a match, a union that would have changed everything. I'm the Westeros verdict, and today we're putting Eddard Stark on trial. And before this case is over, I'm going to show you the marriage alliance Ned planned that would have prevented the War of the Five Kings entirely. But first, we need to answer the question nobody asks. Was Ned Stark's honor actually illegal? Let's examine the evidence. Here's how this trial works. I'm going to present 3 pieces of evidence. Each one proves Ned Stark violated the laws he swore to uphold. Then we'll hear the defense argue why he was right to break those laws. And finally, you, the jury, will deliver the verdict in the comments. But here's what makes this case different from every other Ned Stark analysis you've seen. I'm going to prove that Ned didn't just hide Jon Snow to protect him. He was planning something much bigger. A political alliance. A marriage. The match that was promised. And when you understand what Ned was building, you'll see why his death didn't just kill one honorable man. It destroyed the only plan that could have stopped the chaos that followed. But before we get to that promise, we need to establish the pattern. Because Ned Stark's first act of treason happened before Jon was even born. Let's begin with Exhibit A. Exhibit A. Ned Stark joined a rebellion against the rightful king without legal standing. Now you're thinking, but Aerys was the Mad King. He burned Ned's father and brother alive. And you're right. But here's the question that determines guilt or innocence. Does a crime against your family justify overthrowing a king? The answer, according to Westerosi law, is no. Let me show you why. In the laws of the Seven Kingdoms, there are only 2 legal grounds for deposing a monarch. First, the king commits tyranny against the entire realm, not just individuals. Second, the faith of the Seven declares the king unfit to rule. When Maegor the Cruel slaughtered the faith militant and burned entire houses, the High Septon declared him a tyrant and called for his removal. That's legal rebellion. When Aerys killed Rickard and Brandon Stark, that was the murder of 2 nobles. A horrific crime, yes, but not realm-wide tyranny. So here's the answer to our first question. Ned's rebellion wasn't legal. It was personal revenge dressed up as justice. But wait, it gets worse. Because even if we say Aerys deserved to be overthrown, there's a second legal problem. Who gets the throne after he's gone? And this is where Ned made his first catastrophic choice. Robert Baratheon's only claim to the throne came from his grandmother, Rhael Targaryen, which sounds legitimate until you do the math. If Targaryen blood is what makes you king, then Robert had less claim than Viserys Targaryen, less claim than Daenerys Targaryen, and definitely less claim than Rhaegar's children, including the baby everyone thought was killed at King's Landing, and the baby that Ned found at the Tower of Joy. So here's what really happened. Ned helped his best friend steal a throne that belonged to Ned's own nephew. Not because it was legal, because Robert was his brother in all but name. Honor over law. Loyalty over legitimacy. Now the defense is going to say something important here, and I want you to hear it, because it reveals the tragedy of Ned's entire life. The defense argues that Aerys didn't just kill 2 nobles. He called for the heads of Ned Stark and Robert Baratheon, the Lord of Winterfell and the Lord of Storm's End. When a king demands the execution of great lords without trial, that's tyranny against the realm's entire power structure. And when Jon Arryn refused to hand them over, Aerys was effectively declaring war on the concept of lordship itself. So yes, the rebellion had legal standing. But Robert's claim to the throne afterward? That's where the treason lives. But here's what the defense can't explain. If Ned knew Robert's claim was weak, why didn't he put forward the legitimate heir? Why didn't Ned tell Robert about Jon? The answer to that question is what this entire trial is about, and it involves a promise Ned made, not at the Tower of Joy, years later. But before I show you what Ned was planning, we need to see the second crime, because this one affected every single character in Game of Thrones. Exhibit B. Ned Stark concealed the true heir to the Iron Throne and lied to his king, his wife, and his best friend for 16 years. But here's what I need you to understand before we go further. Why did Ned lie? Not the emotional reason. We know he loved his sister. I mean the political reason. What was Ned's endgame? Because if Ned just wanted to save Jon's life, there were a dozen ways to do that. He could have sent Jon to Essos with a trusted knight. He could have claimed Jon was the son of a Shara Dane, not his own bastard. He could have told Robert the baby died and raised Jon in secret as a ward. But Ned didn't do any of those things. Ned brought Jon to Winterfell, raised him as a Stark, trained him alongside his trueborn sons, gave him a direwolf, made sure Jon was part of every family moment, even though it destroyed Ned's relationship with Catelyn. Why? Why risk everything to keep Jon so close? Because Ned Stark was preparing Jon Snow to be king. Not immediately, not openly, but when the time was right. And the mechanism for that claim? A marriage alliance that would unite the Targaryen bloodline with the Stark name, giving Jon an unquestionable right to rule. The match that was promised. Jon Snow and Sansa Stark. Let me show you the evidence. First, look at how Ned structured his household. Robb was the heir to Winterfell. That's non-negotiable. Bran was being trained for the clergy, or to serve as Robb's advisor. Rickon was too young. That leaves Jon, who Ned trained identically to Robb, and Sansa, who Catelyn was training to be a political wife. Now, in noble families, daughters are political assets. They marry to create alliances. But look at Ned's plan for Sansa before Robert arrived. He wasn't shopping her to other houses. She was being prepared for something. But we never see Ned negotiating a match. Why? Because the match was already decided. He just couldn't announce it yet. Here's the political brilliance. If Jon marries Sansa, Jon gains legitimacy through her true-born Stark blood. Their children would be both Targaryen and Stark. When Robert died, and Robert was drinking himself to death, everyone knew it, Jon could reveal his true parentage with Sansa at his side. The North would support him because he's Ned Stark's nephew and married to Ned Stark's daughter. The Targaryen loyalists would support him because he's Rhaegar's legitimate son. And because he was raised by Ned Stark, he'd rule with honor instead of madness. This is why Ned kept Jon so close, not just out of love, out of preparation. You are a Stark. You might not have my name, but you have my blood. But here's the legal problem. By concealing Jon's identity from King Robert, Ned committed constructive treason, knowingly hiding information that would alter the succession. And by planning to eventually reveal Jon and put him on the throne, that's conspiracy to commit treason. Now you're asking, if Ned's plan was so brilliant, what went wrong? Robert Baratheon showed up and offered to make Sansa queen by marrying her to Joffrey. And Ned, who had spent years preparing a match between Jon and Sansa, who had kept the most dangerous secret in Westeros for 16 years, who had built a plan that could have peacefully restored the Targaryen line, said yes. In one conversation, Ned Stark destroyed his own conspiracy. He gave away the one person who could legitimize Jon's claim. Because when your king and best friend asks you to join your houses, how do you say no without explaining why? And this is where the legal treason becomes complete. The moment Ned agreed to marry Sansa to Joffrey, he was committing his daughter to support a false king, Joffrey, who had no legitimate claim because he wasn't Robert's true son. Ned suspected this. He was already investigating the Baratheon lineage. So Ned knowingly promised his daughter to a bastard born of incest while hiding the legitimate heir in his own house. But wait, the defense has something important to say here, because I'm about to show you how this lie might have actually saved the realm. The defense argues that Ned's lie and his planned marriage alliance was the only moral path available. Think about the alternative. If Ned reveals Jon immediately after Robert takes the throne, Robert kills the baby. Targaryen purge complete. If Ned tells Robert years later, Robert either executes Ned for lying or starts a civil war to eliminate Jon. If Ned does nothing and Jon never learns the truth, the Targaryen line ends in obscurity. But if Ned waits, prepares Jon, and creates a marriage alliance with Sansa, he gives Jon a path to the throne that doesn't require war. The North, the Riverlands through Catelyn's family, and the Targaryen loyalists would all unite behind Jon and Sansa. So yes, Ned committed treason. But that treason was the only way to prevent more bloodshed. Except it didn't prevent bloodshed, because Ned's plan required something he couldn't guarantee: time. And the one thing Westeros never had was time. The moment Bran climbed that tower, the clock started ticking, and Ned's careful, honorable plan fell apart in weeks. But there's one more crime, and this one Ned committed in front of the entire city. Exhibit C. Ned Stark confessed to treason he didn't commit, and by the law of Westeros, that confession made everything he'd done, including protecting Jon, legally classified as treason. Now, you already know Ned confessed to save Sansa and Arya. That's the emotional truth. But here's the legal question nobody asks. What exactly did Ned confess to? Let's hear his own words. "I am Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Hand of the King. I come before you to confess my treason. I betrayed the faith of my king and the trust of my friend, Robert. I swore to protect and defend his children, but before his blood was cold, I plotted to murder his son and seize the throne for myself." Here's what makes this confession so devastating. It's partially true. Ned did betray Robert's trust by hiding Jon. He did plot to prevent Joffrey from taking the throne. He didn't plan to seize it for himself, but he was planning to give it to someone else, eventually Jon. And here's the legal nightmare. In Westerosi law, a public confession witnessed by the High Septon is legally binding. It doesn't matter if Ned was coerced. It doesn't matter if he was lying to save his daughters. The moment those words left Ned's mouth, witnessed by hundreds of people and the Faith of the Seven, Eddard Stark became a traitor by law. But here's the question that will determine your verdict. If Ned had refused to confess, if he'd told the truth about Jon and Joffrey right there in front of everyone, what would have happened? Let me walk you through it. Ned stands before the crowd and says, "Joffrey is not Robert's son. He's the product of incest between Cersei and Jaime Lannister. I am not a traitor. I was protecting the realm." Cersei orders his execution anyway. Joffrey, being Joffrey, probably makes it more painful. Ned dies. Sansa is still a hostage. The North still goes to war. So the confession didn't save anyone. It just made Ned legally guilty of crimes he either didn't commit or committed for the right reasons. But what if Ned had gone further? What if in that moment he'd revealed the final secret? Joffrey is a bastard, but there is a true heir. Rhaegar Targaryen's son lives. His name is Jon. He was raised as my bastard, and I plan to marry him to my daughter Sansa to unite the realm. Chaos. Immediate chaos. But also the truth. And the truth is, the one thing that might have prevented the War of the Five Kings, the rise of the Sparrows, the fall of House Stark, and maybe even the disaster at King's Landing. Because here's what Ned's silence cost. Without Jon's claim being public, 5 kings went to war. Without the Jon-Sansa alliance, the North fractured. Without the truth about Joffrey being proven, the Lannisters held power long enough to destabilize the entire realm. One lie. Tens of thousands dead. And the one person who could have stopped it all? Jon Snow, the prince that was promised, trained by Ned Stark to rule with honor, prepared to marry Sansa and unite the great houses, spent years at the Wall, believing he was a bastard with no claim to anything. The match that was promised never happened. The plan that could have saved Westeros died with Ned. Which brings us to the only question that matters. So here's the verdict I would deliver. By the law of Westeros, Eddard Stark is guilty of treason 3 times over. He supported a rebellion that placed a weak-blooded king on the throne instead of the legitimate Targaryen heir. He concealed that heir for 16 years, planning a marriage conspiracy that would eventually overthrow the Baratheon dynasty. And he confessed publicly to treason, making it legally binding regardless of the truth. Guilty. 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 But what if the law itself was the crime? Because here's what the Iron Throne never understood. A kingdom built on laws without honor is just tyranny with paperwork. Ned Stark chose honor over law. He chose love over legitimacy. He chose protecting an innocent child over maintaining a political alliance. He chose his daughters' lives over his own confession of truth. And every single choice was illegal. But those illegal choices saved Jon Snow. And Jon Snow became the shield that guards the realms of men, the sword in the darkness, the man who united the North and the wildlings, who rallied the great houses against the Night King, who literally died and came back to protect the living. The law would have killed him as a baby. Ned's treason kept him alive. So here's the question I can't answer for you. Does the outcome justify the treason? If Ned's lies saved the realm from the Long Night, was he guilty or heroic? And here's the harder question. If Ned had lived, if the Jon-Sansa match had happened, if the Targaryen heir had taken the throne with the Stark family's support, would Daenerys have ever invaded? Would the Sept of Baelor still stand? Would the Red Wedding have happened? We'll never know, because the one thing Ned Stark couldn't plan for was himself. His honor wouldn't let him lie to Robert's face about Sansa and Joffrey. His love for his daughters wouldn't let him stay silent in the black cells. His mercy toward Cersei gave her time to strike first. The man who planned a years-long conspiracy to restore the Targaryen line peacefully couldn't commit to the ruthlessness that plan required. And so the match that was promised became the war that destroyed a generation. So legally, Ned Stark is guilty. Morally, I'm not sure the Iron Throne ever had the right to judge him. But that's not my call. It's yours. Here's what I need you to do right now. In the comments, deliver your verdict, guilty or innocent. But here's the rule. You have to defend your ruling with evidence from the show or the books. Quote a law, cite a scene, reference a character's testimony. Because the top 3 argued verdicts are going to be read aloud and challenged in next week's trial. And speaking of next week, we just put the most honorable man in Westeros on trial. Now we're putting the opposite on the stand. A man who never broke a law, who had the strongest legal claim to the throne, who followed duty over love, justice over mercy, and the letter of the law over every human feeling. Stannis Baratheon, the only legal king, or Westeros' biggest traitor. Because if Ned's crime was choosing honor over law, Stannis' crime was choosing law over everything else. And I'm going to prove that his legally correct decisions killed more people than Ned's treason ever did. Click that subscribe button right now so you don't miss it, because I'm building a case that's going to change how you see the entire War of the Five Kings. And leave your verdict below. Guilty or innocent. Defend your choice. Because Ned Stark died believing he was saving his daughters, but he might have doomed the realm instead. Or maybe the match that was promised just took a different path. Court adjourned.